The National Judicial Council commenced a formal review of the judgment delivered by Justice James Omotosho following concerns raised about the legal foundation of the sentence imposed in the case involving Nnamdi Kanu. The review was conducted strictly within the NJC's constitutional mandate to oversee judicial conduct and discipline judicial officers. From the outset, the NJC confined its inquiry to matters of law, procedure, and judicial responsibility. Issues outside judicial discipline, including political commentary or public reaction, were excluded from consideration. The Council's task was to determine whether the judge acted within the bounds of the law and the ethical standards expected of a judicial officer. The investigation identified a single controlling issue: the status of the law relied upon by the court at the time of sentencing. To resolve this, the NJC examined the judgment itself, paying close attention to the statutory provisions cited as the legal basis for the conviction and sentence. The Council then compared those provisions with official legislative records, including repeal instruments, amendments, and published gazettes. The outcome of this verification process was clear. The statute relied upon by the court had been abolished prior to the date on which the sentence was imposed. Under Nigerian law, once a statute is repealed or abolished, it loses all legal effect. It cannot create offences, support convictions, or authorize punishment. Based on this finding, the NJC concluded that the trial court acted without valid jurisdiction in relying on the abolished statute. Jurisdiction is not a procedural technicality. It is the foundation of judicial authority. Where a court lacks jurisdiction, any decision flowing from that proceeding is legally defective. The Council emphasized that criminal jurisdiction, in particular, is strictly governed by the principle of legality. A person may only be convicted and punished under a law that is in force at the time of the alleged offense and at the time of judgment. This principle is entrenched in Nigeria's constitutional framework and reinforced by long-standing judicial precedent. The NJC further examined the professional obligations of judges in criminal proceedings. Judges are required to ascertain the current status of the law before applying it. This includes confirming whether a statute has been amended, repealed, or replaced. The Council noted that statutory repeals are matters of public record and form part of the legal materials available to the courts. The investigation also considered whether the error could be categorized as a mere mistake of interpretation. The NJC rejected this characterization. The issue was not the interpretation of a valid law, but the application of a law that no longer existed. In the Council's assessment, this distinction was critical. The NJC then reviewed whether the jurisdictional defect was raised or addressed at any stage during the proceedings. Courts possess inherent authority to examine jurisdiction on their own motion. Where a jurisdictional issue arises, the proper course is to resolve it before proceeding further. The Council found no indication that corrective steps were taken before the sentence was imposed. This failure to identify or correct the defect formed part of the NJC's assessment of judicial conduct. The Council considered whether the circumstances pointed to negligence, recklessness, or disregard for established legal requirements. While intent was not determined at this stage, the NJC concluded that the conduct met the threshold for prima facie gross judicial misconduct. Under NJC rules, gross judicial misconduct includes actions that undermine the integrity of the judicial process, violate constitutional safeguards, or demonstrate a fundamental failure to uphold the law. The Council determined that sentencing an individual under an abolished statute satisfied these criteria. The NJC also assessed the severity of the consequence arising from the conduct. The sentence imposed was life imprisonment, one of the most severe penalties available under Nigerian law. The Council noted that the gravity of the outcome heightened the seriousness of the misconduct and reinforced the need for formal disciplinary action. Having completed its investigation, the NJC reached a procedural decision. Informal measures, such as caution or reprimand, were deemed inadequate. The Council resolved that the matter required adjudication through its highest disciplinary mechanism. Accordingly, the NJC decided to convene a full disciplinary hearing. This step marked the transition from preliminary investigation to formal proceedings. At the hearing stage, the judicial officer would be afforded the opportunity to respond to the findings, present explanations, and address the Council on the issues identified. The NJC's decision to initiate a full disciplinary hearing was based solely on legal and institutional considerations. The purpose was to determine whether Justice James Omotosho remained fit to continue in judicial office in light of the established findings. With this decision, the investigation phase formally concluded. The matter moved into the disciplinary phase, where the NJC would consider the evidence, apply its rules, and determine the appropriate sanction under the Constitution and the NJC guidelines. Following the conclusion of its preliminary investigation, the National Judicial Council formally constituted a full disciplinary panel to hear the case against Justice James Omotosho. This action was taken in accordance with the NJC's constitutional mandate and its established disciplinary procedures. The purpose of the hearing was specific and limited, to determine whether the conduct identified during the investigation amounted to misconduct warranting removal from judicial office. Justice Omotosho was formally notified of the allegations against him. The notice outlined the findings of the investigation, including the determination that an abolished statute was relied upon as the legal basis for sentencing. The judge was afforded the opportunity to respond, in line with the principles of fair hearing and due process. At the hearing, the NJC panel reviewed documentary evidence, including the full text of the judgment, the statutory provisions cited, official repeal instruments and gazetted records, relevant constitutional provisions governing criminal jurisdiction. The panel's examination focused on objective legal facts, not subjective intent. The central question was not whether the judge intended to act unlawfully, but whether his actions complied with the law and judicial standards. The NJC reaffirmed a core principle: a judge's authority flows entirely from the law. Where a judge acts outside the law, the authority of the office is exceeded. The panel emphasized that reliance on an abolished statute removes the legal foundation upon which judicial power rests. During the hearing, the panel assessed whether the conduct could be excused as a technical error. The NJC rejected this characterization. It held that applying a repealed law is not an interpretive mistake but a jurisdictional failure. A court cannot exercise criminal jurisdiction under a law that no longer exists. The panel further considered the professional obligations imposed on judges. Judicial officers are expected to verify the current status of laws before applying them, particularly in criminal matters where personal liberty is at stake. The NJC found that this obligation is heightened where severe penalties are involved. The hearing also examined whether procedural safeguards were available to correct the defect before sentencing. Courts possess inherent powers to raise and determine jurisdictional issues at any stage of proceedings. The panel found no evidence that such corrective measures were taken prior to the imposition of sentence. In evaluating the conduct, the NJC applied its standards for gross judicial misconduct. These standards include acts that undermine the rule of law, demonstrate disregard for constitutional requirements, bring the judiciary into disrepute, result in unlawful deprivation of liberty. The panel concluded that the conduct under review satisfied these criteria. The use of an abolished statute to impose a life sentence was deemed incompatible with the obligations of judicial office. The NJC also considered proportionality in determining the appropriate sanction. Lesser disciplinary measures, such as warning or suspension, were reviewed. The panel concluded that such measures would be inadequate given the fundamental nature of the legal defect, the severity of the sentence imposed, the implications for judicial credibility. The panel emphasized that judicial independence does not shield judges from accountability. Independence protects judges from external interference, not from consequences arising from violations of the law. Maintaining public confidence in the judiciary requires that serious misconduct be addressed decisively. After deliberation, the disciplinary panel made a formal recommendation to the full council. The recommendation was that Justice James Omotosho be removed from office on the grounds of gross judicial misconduct arising from the application of an abolished law in a criminal case. The full council reviewed the panel's findings and recommendation. In doing so, it examined whether the disciplinary process complied with constitutional and procedural requirements. The council confirmed that the judge had been afforded fair hearing and that the findings were supported by the evidence. Upon completion of this review, the NJC adopted the recommendation. The council resolved that Justice James Omotosho could no longer continue in judicial office, as his actions were inconsistent with the standards required of a judge. The decision marked the conclusion of the disciplinary hearing process. The NJC's role at this stage was limited to judicial discipline. The Council did not address the validity of the underlying conviction, as that matter falls within the jurisdiction of appellate courts. The NJC documented its decision and prepared the necessary instruments to give effect to the removal, in accordance with constitutional procedures. This action represented the final disciplinary outcome within the NJC framework. With the hearing concluded and the decision taken, the matter proceeded to its final institutional phase, implementation of removal and its implications for the judiciary, which would be addressed next. Following the adoption of the disciplinary panel's recommendation, the National Judicial Council proceeded to implement its decision to remove Justice James Omotosho from judicial office. This phase marked the conclusion of the NJC's disciplinary jurisdiction and the transition to institutional and legal consequences arising from the removal. The NJC's first step was formal documentation. A written resolution outlining the findings, the disciplinary process followed, and the final decision was prepared in accordance with constitutional requirements. This documentation served as the official record of the Council's action and provided the legal basis for implementation. In line with established procedure, the NJC transmitted its recommendation for removal to the appropriate constitutional authority empowered to give effect to such decisions. The NJC's role at this stage was advisory and disciplinary. Implementation followed the constitutional chain provided for judicial appointments and removals. Upon completion of this process, Justice James Omotosho ceased to hold judicial office. From that point, he no longer possessed the authority, privileges, or immunities associated with the bench. He could no longer sit, preside over cases, or issue judicial orders. The NJC's involvement concluded with the removal. The Council does not exercise criminal or appellate jurisdiction and does not determine the validity of judgments delivered by removed judges. Its mandate is limited to discipline and regulation of judicial conduct. The removal, however, triggered several institutional consequences. First, the judiciary initiated administrative steps to reassign any pending cases previously handled by Justice Omotosho. Matters not concluded were transferred to other judges of competent jurisdiction. This reassignment ensured continuity of judicial business and prevented procedural delays. Second, the judgment that formed the basis of the disciplinary action became subject to heightened scrutiny within the appellate system. While the NJC does not overturn judgments, its findings regarding the use of an abolished law introduced a material issue relevant to appellate review. Appellate courts retain exclusive authority to determine whether such judgments are void, should be set aside, or require further legal action. Third, the removal reinforced internal judicial compliance mechanisms. Courts reviewed procedures for verifying statutory authority, particularly in criminal matters involving severe penalties. Judicial officers were reminded of the obligation to confirm the current status of laws before reliance. From an institutional perspective, the NJC's action reaffirmed the distinction between judicial independence and judicial accountability. Independence protects judges from improper influence. Accountability ensures adherence to the law. The removal demonstrated that independence does not extend to actions taken without legal foundation. The NJC also clarified that disciplinary action against a judge does not automatically determine liability beyond removal from office. Any further legal consequences, including civil claims or criminal investigations, fall outside the NJC's mandate and depend on separate legal processes initiated by competent authorities. The Council's decision further emphasized the principle that jurisdictional defects are fundamental. A court acting without jurisdiction cannot produce legally sustainable outcomes. This principle guided subsequent institutional reviews and training programs within the judiciary. The removal also affected judicial records. Decisions delivered by Justice Omotosho remained part of the judicial archive but became subject to review where jurisdictional issues were raised on appeal. Each case would be addressed individually by appellate courts based on applicable law. In administrative terms, the NJC updated its registry to reflect the change in judicial status. Benefits, entitlements, and post-service considerations were addressed in accordance with applicable rules, subject to the terms of removal and relevant regulations. The judiciary, as an institution, treated the matter as a disciplinary precedent rather than a political event. Internal memoranda focused on procedural compliance, statutory verification, and jurisdictional safeguards. The aim was institutional correction, not public commentary. At the appellate level, courts reviewing related matters were guided by established legal standards. Where a conviction or sentence is found to rest on an abolished statute, appellate courts possess authority to declare such proceedings a nullity, set aside sentences, or issue appropriate orders consistent with constitutional requirements. These determinations remain independent of NJC proceedings. The NJC's final action in the matter was to close the disciplinary file upon completion of removal. The Council's records reflected that due process was observed, fair hearing was afforded, and the decision was reached through established procedures. The broader consequence of the removal was institutional clarity. Judges were reminded that the validity of judicial authority depends entirely on the existence and applicability of the law relied upon. Where that foundation fails, judicial power cannot be sustained. By concluding the process through removal, the NJC reaffirmed its role as the guardian of judicial standards. The action underscored that errors affecting jurisdiction and legality, particularly in criminal cases, are not matters for informal correction but for formal accountability. With implementation completed, the NJC's involvement ended. Any further legal developments, including appellate outcomes or ancillary proceedings, would proceed within their respective jurisdictions. This marked the final stage of the NJC's disciplinary process: investigation, hearing, decision, and removal, completed within the framework of constitutional authority and institutional responsibility.